So as I mentioned earlier, today Jacqueline and Maureen and I are focusing on the theme of helping. Our focusing question includes, how can I really help? Maybe you've asked that question of yourself now and then. We are highlighting what I feel is an essential human quality, often emphasized by our religious traditions: caring for others. Naturally included in our reflections is the recognition of the challenges and the questions that sometimes arise as we want to be helpful. We find ourselves wondering, what would really be helpful in this situation? What does helping in a particular situation actually involve? And sometimes the question, am I up to it? Am I able to really help in this moment? As I begin my own ponderings on these questions, I couldn't help but think of my early formation in home, church, and school. As most of you know by now, I was raised Roman Catholic and attended Roman Catholic schools during my formative years until around age 16. And early on, the message and example was instilled in me and others in this Catholic milieu to look for ways to be of service to others, to help. There was, for example, a designated poor box at the entrances of the church where we could place coins that would be donated to those in need. We had periodic food drives and clothing drives. And as I was reflecting on this, I had an unexpected and somewhat distracting memory that came back to me. We even had collections at times for pagan babies. Anyone else remember that? Now, that could be a whole other sermon, so I'm going to keep it short. Apparently, our coins that we collected in a box would go to support missionaries in countries around the world that would then baptize children, pagan children, as they were called. I didn't question it at the time when they passed out the boxes for us to collect our coins and bring them back to school a month later. But I have been wondering, whatever happened to those pagan babies? We read stories about the official saints of the church who did great and miraculous and marvelous things. For example, Saint Damien of Malachi, the Belgian priest who devoted his life to building hospitals and schools and orphanages on this island, Malachi, where lepers had been placed. We also read biographies of more modern, maybe less saintly people who sought to help others. Florence Nightingale, Gandhi, Albert Schweitzer are among some of those that I remember hearing about. We often heard that story from the Christian Gospels, from Matthew chapter 25. It conveys a scene in heaven when Jesus says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And then when asked, when did they ever see Jesus in need of clothing, in need of food, Jesus in prison or sick, and Jesus replied, "Whatever you," some of you could complete the sentence for me, "whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." So this was the milieu in which I was raised. And again, the value of serving, even when it could mean self-sacrifice or even martyrdom, were told to us again and again. By the time I was in ninth grade at my Catholic high school, I had signed up for one of the several after-school service projects. And I signed up to read books, school books, to a blind person just a few years older than I. And so once a week, I would show up and I would read to him in the community setting where he resided. In other words, the idea of serving and opportunities for helping were infused in the social and the religious culture in which I was raised, and perhaps for many of you as well. My helping was not always too nuanced, particularly when I was a young boy. I recall once as a 10-year-old, a man who appeared to be in need came to our front door. He asked for money because he said he was hungry. I instinctively found my blue-colored piggy bank. My sister had a pink piggy bank, and it was filled with coins, and I dumped it into the hat that he held out to receive them. Later on that same day, I was on my way to the playground with some of my friends, and I noticed that man standing outside of a bar in the middle of the day, clearly looking like he had satisfied his thirst for alcohol, since he appeared fairly drunk. We caught each other's eye, and I'm not sure if he actually recognized me, but I felt duped by my wanting to help him, and I almost shared my experience with my buddies, but I could sense they might have ridiculed me for being so gullible, and so I kept it to myself, and my eyes lingered on this man in need for just a little longer. Helping is not always easy. How to actually be of help is not always clear. And in their book, How Can I Help? Stories and Reflections on Service, Paul Gorman and Ram Dass explore some of the complicated and nuanced dimensions of helping through telling their own stories and including the stories of countless others that they had interviewed. They explored the question many of us have often asked as we do what we can. Will I have what it takes? How much is enough? How can I deal with suffering? And what really helps anyway? They offer reflections that allow us to look at our own responses to their guiding questions. And for example, they point out that frequently our reactiveness to suffering takes the form of instantly having to do something, to do anything. This they call the we gotta syndrome, which they explain in this way. See if you recognize it in yourself, anyone around you. It goes like this: we got to fix this up right away. We got to call this person for advice. It's tricky because this impulse may arise from genuine empathy, but the form of action can sometimes be compulsive. Often what's happening is that we gotta get rid of someone's pain because it's hurting us too much. Its true neurotic dimension is most evident when there's nothing really to do. Yet we still must talk to that nurse, question that doctor, call that specialist, rearrange the furniture, change the TV channel, straighten the bed for the 5th time in the last 20 minutes, and asking, "Are you sure you're all right, dear? Really? Really?" Recognize that we gotta syndrome, anybody? Yeah. Now, they point out that oftentimes our natural compassion gets misdirected or comes from a response in us that is worthy to pay attention to. For example, we might not notice our own uncomfortableness with suffering that might get played out in this we got to do something, we got to do anything, just anything kind of dynamic. We might not notice that our own fear of suffering, our own discomfort with helplessness can sometimes enter into the dynamic of wanting to be of help. When Gorman and Ram Dass point out is that to truly be of help, we may need to attend to ourselves in the helping moment as much as the one that we are trying to help. Drawing on their meditation practice that encourages us to cultivate our own inner witness, so that we can observe our inclinations, our fears, and our emotions about suffering or helplessness as they are occurring. They encourage us to soften our tendency to act on them right away, out of denial and fear of our own experiences, or instinctively without awareness. And they provide this useful lesson. My quote, "The witness catches us in the act, but gently without reproach, so we can simply acknowledge our reactivity and begin to let it fall away, allowing our natural compassion to come more into play. The witness gives us a little more room." The witness may also allow us to really attend to ourselves as we also attend to the other in the situation. The witness may allow us to really hear. When we become, and I quote from them, less busy pushing away suffering, less frenzied having to do something about it, we're able to get a sense of what they are feeling, of what they feel they need. We may be startled to discover that what they've been asking for all along is entirely different from what we've been so busy offering. All I want is for you to sit here next to me, they might say. I don't care about the nurse, the IV is working fine, the bed is comfortable. Just sit with me. Quieter now, we can recognize such a need, often without it even having to be expressed. Perhaps even before it's consciously felt, we'll just come into the room and sit down and say hello. The witness is not passive or complacent or indifferent. Indeed, it's not attached to a particular outcome. Its presence turns out to bring about the change. Its presence turns out to bring about the change. As we bring what is into the light of clear awareness, we begin to see that the universe is providing us with abundant clues, they say, as to the nature of suffering before us. What is being asked? What fears have been inhibiting us? And finally, what might really help? All we have to do is listen. Really listen. Jacqueline.
Thank you, Reverend Larry. I've already introduced myself as your worship associate today. In my work life, I'm a professional counselor. And in that role, an announcement that I've provided a handout for mental health resources. It's at the back of the sanctuary on the table below the name tags. So when Reverend Larry asked me for a reflection, I thought about how I'm honored to support my clients as they navigate life's challenges. And I thought of other cherished roles, that of wife, mother, and daughter. This sermon topic encouraged me to reflect on visits to my dad when he was in the healthcare facility of assisted living community. It was spring 2022. My mom had suddenly passed away that winter. At the time of my visits, my dad was coping with the unexpected loss of his wife and living with mobility, sight, and hearing limitations. I spent a lot of time with him. During the majority of visits, my father was a brave, peaceful man. My dad, Dr. Charles Regal, Bud Regal, was a Wilmington physician and internist known for on-spot diagnoses, as well as a very comforting bedside manner. Yet now, struggling with health issues and loss, he could occasionally be grumpy. One day when visiting Dad in healthcare, I had on my mind there was a musician scheduled to sing and lead a sing-along. My dad loved to sing. He will like this. Entering his room, I said, "Hi, Dad, it's Jacqueline." He answered with a simple, "Hi." My mind was still on getting him to that musical program. "How are you today?" "Not so good today. I'm blind and nearly deaf." I said, that's difficult. I reached out and patted his arm. He jerked his arm away. "Don't do that." My dad responded with a sudden, strong voice. I felt surprise, confusion, hurt. While experiencing some flood of emotion, I also knew I wanted to stay. So I took a breath and turned on some quiet jazz via the music player we had set up in his room. Perhaps no sing-along today. One of the psychologists that I follow is Carl Rogers, the renowned humanist. Carl Rogers wrote, "As I try to listen to myself and the experience going on in me, and then I try to extend that same listening attuned to another person, the more respect I feel for the complex processes of life." When my dad raised his voice to me and told me to stop, I felt small, inadequate. Then it occurred to me that my dad, he may be feeling that way too, inadequate. So I gave myself an inner squeeze, slowed myself down, and listened. My dad said, still in a gruff, pressured voice, he said, "I didn't know. How could I not know?" I said, "You didn't know?" He said, "I was not awake. I was not there for your mom when she had the headache, the stroke. How could I not know? She was right there." Even in healthcare, my parents slept next to each other. My mom had pushed the 2 twin hospital beds side by side. Then his tears spilled out, and his voice more softly, "I can't see. I can barely hear." I helped him verbalize what it's like to have physical limitations after being a very present, active, caring person. He spoke about the deep missing and the loss he was feeling. Then he remembered that recently my mom had told him about some of her worries and self-doubt, and he had listened. Just before her death, he had comforted and assured her. Helping can be both beautiful and wonderfully tender, and confusing and deeply fatiguing. We are asked to help by the people and groups we most care about, our partners, our family, our friends, this church. Since it's important and it's coming out of love, how can we take care of both ourselves and others? What can we hold with us when we're helping? How to stay compassionate. Reading Christian Neff, a psychologist that specializes in compassion, she writes, "One critical, important part of compassion is to emphasize common humanity versus kind of falling into that feeling of separateness or isolation. She writes, the very definition of being human means that one is mortal, vulnerable, and imperfect. Therefore, self-compassion involves recognizing that suffering and personal inadequacy is part of the shared human experience. Something that we all go through, rather than being something that happens to me alone or something that happens to someone else. Here was my father, a beloved, brilliant physician, a caring husband. And he was thinking he did not have enough for his wife during her health crisis. And I, his daughter, held an inner worry when visiting him that I did not have enough to soothe his grief and sadness. That day, my dad addressed me in a serious tone and said, "I don't mean to be like that." I replied, "I know, Dad." The tears were dried by his cloth handkerchief that he wore every day. Mom, and now the nurses, always make sure one was handy. The music quietly played on. One of us would occasionally hum or tap. I noticed his expression started to change into his smile. And he reached out his hand for me. He said, "I'm so glad I have a daughter." Perhaps in that visit, we were both reminded that simply being there was enough. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Maureen Sandberg. Maureen?
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Can you hear me okay? Oh, good. Let me get comfy on my stool here. So many of you no doubt remember Marge Meyerman. Marge was a wonderful friend to you, First You, and among other things that she did for the church, she ran a caregivers group. Marge opened up her home, I believe, once a week to anybody who would want to talk about the issues they were facing. She had a wonderful, very lit up room with comfy chairs and decorated with all her well cared for plants. Marge even took 24/7 phone calls. She invited anybody to call anytime they needed to. Marge gave every individual an opportunity to share. She'd go around the room. It was okay if you didn't want to share. And in fact, for first-timers, she said, you may not want to share until you get to know us a little bit. She emphasized that what was said in the room stayed in the room. She, besides giving an opportunity for people to talk about their caregiving issues, she always emphasized, what are you doing to help yourself? An important feature of her conducting the group. I was in the group for 10 years. I was never a direct caregiver, but I spent a good deal of my time managing care for family members and a dear friend. My first reason for joining the group involved challenges I was facing, both physically and emotionally, with my daughter Heather, who was profoundly mentally disabled. Over the years, I talked about my mother's dementia, my dear husband's alcoholism, and a dear friend's severe dementia. It was helpful to be able to talk about my issues freely without judgment, and also with a boatload of empathy. Marge was so caring, she went as far as to rally the groups and some of the people in the group to travel 45 minutes to my daughter's care facility to attend her memorial service. When Marge passed away, I frequently felt her channeling me from heaven, maybe? Who knows? Suggesting that maybe I ought to take a crack at continuing the caregivers group. Along with Larry's subtle suggestions in his frequent sermons that we get off our duffs and do something. Not a quote, not a quote. I decided I would take on the challenge of conducting a caregivers group. Am I best qualified to lead the group? Who knows? But I certainly have had a lot of experiences and a lot of exposure to how Marge dealt with issues. We've had 7 people come through the group so far, and I believe it's been helpful to them, and it's also had its reward for me. One of our caregivers sent me this note after her first visit. "Thank you for inviting me. It made me realize I'm not alone struggling with these emotions. I don't know that I would fare as well with the problems the others have. I feel comforted that I have some place to turn." Caregiving is hard, no matter what your involvement in it. And it's good to blow off steam. It's good to share it with others. Get it off your chest. I believe that showing people care is the most important thing that I do. I go so far as, I don't know if you all remember, but you probably do, when you're traveling along the street, you see these guys with stop, slow signs. I always wave at them. And I know that after I do that, I know they say, "Oh my God, what's this old lady doing?" But I hope that they give a little thought to that and think, "Oh my God, she really cares that I'm there."
So thank you so much, Jacqueline and Maureen. Let's give them a little wave. Let's take a moment just to gather whatever wisdom we've gathered from hearing these reflections, whatever wisdom you've gathered for yourself, and all the ways that you might be called upon to help, to be of help. So let's pause for a moment and gather that inner wisdom. There is a natural compassion in us that wants to be expressed. And we can hone and develop our way of expressing it over the course of our lives and in the particularities of different situations. So my early training in Catholic schools, as you heard, cultivated in me what I might call the Florence Nightingale persona. It's always there. It's always available to help when needed. But these days, when I'm just a little bit more aware, I can sense that Florence Nightingale persona getting activated in me. And what I've learned as a psychotherapist, as a chaplain, as a minister, is what I continue to also learn as a friend, a spouse, a family member, is to keep developing that witness self, that capacity to listen to myself, listen to the situation, listen to the other, and let this deeper listening and witnessing also form my response to the question, how can I really help? Now, of course, I'm not always successful. That Florence Nightingale persona is pretty entrenched, pretty familiar to me. It can take over. But I still want to jump in sometimes because of that we gotta do something tendency. But God willing and the creek don't rise, I might intercept and hone that natural compassion available to all of us so that I can truly listen. So that's the task for us. The task for us is to be a caring community because we need one another. All of our lives, we need one another. And all of our lives, we are called to find ways to respond.